Hi, I'm Dr. Julie Owens, Professor of Psychology at Ohio University, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Jessica Bottiani from the University of Virginia. Our goal is to describe two IES-funded projects, each of which have a component in assessing teachers' use of equity-centered or equity-focused and culturally responsive classroom practices. To offer a frame for what we're talking about today, I will remind you that in our country, children experiences in school, both socially and academically, differ by the cultural and social groups in which they identify. For example, Black and Brown children are nearly 4 times more likely than white or Asian children to be expelled from school, and less than 20% of Black children, 4th graders, have achieved reading proficiency compared to 45% of their white counterparts. So these inequitable experiences interfere with children's ability to engage in the academic instruction and to thrive socially and emotionally. So we would argue that alternative practices, policies, and procedures, and that we need interdisciplinary partnerships between researchers, educators, mental health providers, and families to engage in this critical process. So I want to start by acknowledging a couple definitions that ground our work, and we pulled these from Equity Literacy Institute, Elena Aguilar's work, and Geneva Gay's work, excuse me. So equity, meaning that every child, regardless of these lived experiences, receives what they need to develop their full potential academically and socially and thrive every day. And culturally responsive practices, an asset-based approach that leverages students' strengths, cultural knowledge, lived experiences, home communication styles to support students' academic and social well-being at school. We also acknowledge that these definitions, the vocabulary that we use, are ever evolving. In fact, some of these terms have certainly changed since we had our proposals funded. So the two development projects that we're going to talk about today, one is by myself and my colleagues, Dr. Dayanara Exner-Cortens at the University of Calgary and Dr. Elise Capella at NYU Steinhardt. And the goal of our project is to collaboratively work with educators to develop materials and procedures to enhance teachers' use of equity-focused positive behavioral supports at sort of the tier 1 and tier 2 level. And Dr. Bottiani's work is in collaboration with Dr. Catherine Bradshaw at the University of Virginia and Keith Herman at Missouri. And their goal is to extend and refine a measurement system to assess culturally sustaining, anti-racist, and equity supportive practices in the classroom. And so they will refer to this as the CARES project. I will go ahead and start by talking about the Maximize project. So in our Goal 2 or development project, we are focused on facilitating teachers' use of equity-centered positive behavioral supports. And we're taking two approaches to this. First, we are using interactive technology to give teachers a private space to start to engage in self-reflection around equity-focused topics, become aware of some of these issues, and then move them to action. So we'll talk a little bit about this interactive, guided, self-paced, confidential space today. And then in addition, we're hoping that we can leverage support from key opinion leaders in the building to facilitate further conversation that around these equity topics and to provide support to teachers with regard to implementation. So for the focus of our project today, we're going to be talking about the measurement pieces that come from our interactive technology. So there's 4 pieces within our interactive technology. The first is a self-assessment. So teachers watch a 4-minute welcome video about the project and they read 10 strategies. And these are sort of the usual suspects around personal greetings and classroom expectations, praise, positive support, effective response to rule violations, community circles, check-ins, and choice. And so as they read these definitions, they rate how frequently they use these strategies, and then also sort of whether they view these strategies as areas of strength, things they're doing well enough, or areas they're actually interested in improving. And so when they finish the self-assessment, it produces a profile for them that looks like this, where they can see areas of potential growth, doing well enough, and areas of strength. So if they click on Learn More, it takes them to a page where they see, again, the definition of the strategy and key features for equity-focused supports. And we've developed these with our multi-state, multidisciplinary advisory board. And like I said, they are ever evolving based on feedback we're getting from our partners. But they can learn a lot about the features, and then there's also handouts and videos, and this is sort of where the professional development happens. And we hope that they will take one of the strategies from their areas for growth and set a goal. So the third component is the goal builder. It's sort of an interactive wizard that walks them through the features that they can select. So if someone selected their goal was to improve providing corrective feedback, then they would select the key feature for equity. So this teacher chose by using a wide range of effective responses that focus on developing student skills and using student choice. Once the goal is built, they get pinged each week to review the goal, and they can sort of say how they're doing with that goal. Oops, I forgot about it. I'm making a little progress, or I'm making a lot of progress. And over time, they can move these goals to mastery. And the fourth piece is a self-reflection activity toolbox. So each activity is designed to be completed in about 10 to 15 minutes. They watch a video or read a vignette, and then they do some self-reflection right there. We're pretty excited about this piece because we're obtaining quantitative feedback in these self-reflection activities, and we're also assessing qualitative reactions. And we're excited about this because I think that, there's not a lot of measurement out there where we're really capturing teachers' initial reactions in the moment where they're thinking about these equity topics. So what I want to do now is just show you a snapshot of the data we're getting around the measurement and talk about some of the lessons learned. And of course, we are excited to engage in discussion with you afterwards. So in this sample for cohort 1, we have 55 general education teachers, consistent with national profiles. They are mostly women who are white. 50% of them have a master's degree, and they've been in the field about 14 years. So when we think about the frequency of use assessment, you can see here that there are 5 strategies where more than 75% of teachers say I am using this often or very often. So greetings, community circles, expectations, classroom expectations, and praise. And really the high use of praise and expectations is consistent with other studies in the literature on these sorts of topics, but also likely highlights sort of the national movement towards positive behavioral supports. It is the first time that we've seen sort of greetings and community circles being asked of teachers, sort of how frequently they're using it. And we're pleased to see that these positive strategies are used by often or very often by a large percentage of teachers. However, when we move on to these 5 strategies, we see that there's a little bit more variability, ranging from 5 to 20% of teachers who say I never or rarely use these things like student choice or individual check-ins with students, but also some variability too in terms of thinking about like how often teachers are using corrective feedback. And this is of interest to us, particularly because we have some of our own work published that shows that while we want the positives to outweigh the corrections, we also do need corrections to be happening more often than not in order to communicate what behaviors are not acceptable in school. We also want teachers to be using things like opportunities to respond, to engage students in learning, and giving students choice to have autonomy in their learning. So these might highlight some areas for focus on professional development for teachers. Next, when teachers set a goal, I'm just going to show you one highlight here. So 10% of teachers chose corrective feedback as the goal they wanted to work on. We viewed this as important, as giving feedback to students is one of those vulnerable decision point times. And it's worth teachers sort of thinking about how can I engage in activities that reduce inequities. And then you'll see here of those 10%, what each of them chose to focus on as the equity focus feature. So 3 chose to work on a wider range of effective responses. Others were sort of thinking about how do I choose when I should ignore? How do I reduce those exclusionary consequences? How can I slow down before responding, modify triggers, or looking at data? And so I think this reflects that there's a variety of ways teachers could improve equity-focused corrective feedback, and that this is a very complex behavior for us to think about with regard to professional development. In terms of the self-reflection activities, in Q1, we had 40 participants who engaged in self-reflection about their own identity, intersectionality, how their identity interfaces with students, and then these just represent a couple other topics. Again, as a snapshot, I'm going to show you some of the quantitative and qualitative data regarding the identity self-reflection. So the participants watched a brief video And then we gave them a statement: celebrating and centering student identities is critical for maximizing student success. And you can see here a high percentage did agree or strongly agree with that. So we're sort of asking these questions without, making some assumptions that we want to see, do folks agree with this? But then we asked teachers, how well do you know your student identities? And you can see there's variability, that 15% do not know their students very well, 60% sort of moderately, and then 25% do feel like they know their identities well. This is an example of an identity wheel. Of a wheel that we showed them. This comes from the Canadian Council for Refugees, and it sort of describes sort of the relative privilege and or disadvantage that folks have with regard to different variables, and it talks about intersectionality. And then we asked some teachers some questions about that. So I just want to briefly show you 3 qualitative themes that emerged from our coding of their qualitative responses. So one theme was just how much teachers do value reflection. So one teacher said, wow, I'd never thought about those identities. I feel like as a teacher, we focus on gender and culture, these visible things. It really makes me think I have a lot to discover. Other teachers said, it makes me realize that I maybe do not align with my students very well as far as identity goes. And so it's really important for me to learn about the different assets they have. A couple other quotes, just that it's sometimes easy to think of students as one-dimensional, the kids sitting in front of me, but remembering that they have different identities is very important. And one more quote was just sort of saying, I'm really trying to remove the judgment from my mind regarding people of color. I don't hold these values, but my family that I was born into might. Referred to them as being racist or saying racist comments. And after working with my students, my ideals have changed. But the first thing that comes to mind is this judgment. So just some really important quotes that I think we're capturing that teachers do value perhaps this private space for self-reflection. Another theme that came out is just, again, a satisfaction about this. So I enjoyed the activity. It makes me sort of really realize that, what my privileges are. I appreciate reflecting on this. Thank you. It was sort of therapy for me. And then a third theme was discomfort and confusion. This makes me feel like maybe I should feel bad for being heterosexual or cisgender. Some questions were confusing to me. I wasn't sure what I was being asked. And I need to learn about how to bring out people's identity to help them know that I acknowledge and respect it. So we do of course, with these activities, we're trying to find this sweet spot where we are engaging them and sort of creating some discomfort, right? Because this work is hard, not pushing them in either way to turning them off or having it be something they already know. So we think that this is an important theme coming out. So just in summary, some lessons learned. We are enjoying sort of finding out what teachers are self-assessing to be their strengths and areas for growth. It is helpful to see that teachers are invested in improving some of these aspects. And what we're hoping to do in our next iteration is, rather than just include the definition and having them go to the Learn More page about the equity focus features, we're going to be embedding those equity focus features right up front so that we can learn more about when they think about it holistically, how often are they using these things. We've also been given feedback that it would be nice that once they selected a feature, that there's really specific activities designed to help them improve that feature rather than just sort of general handouts and videos. The self-reflection activities, we're very excited to see teachers engaging in them, having some really meaningful reflection and capturing this from an assessment standpoint. So it's an effective starting point. But we'll also be working, as I said, the whole other part of this project is identifying folks in the building to serve as sort of ambassadors for the Maximize project and engage in these difficult conversations, facilitate coaching and collaborative learning around equity-focused topics. And so we're going to be working more to how, the challenge in schools is always finding time to maximize those conversations between peers and leaders. So I appreciate your time. I hope that this has piqued your interest in our work, and I look forward to further conversation during our discussion time.
Well, thanks so much, Julie, for your presentation on the Maximize project. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Bottiani, and I'll present on our measurement project next, called the CARES 360 Classroom Assessment System. CARES stands for Culturally Sustaining Anti-Racist and Equity Supportive Practices. It also stands for the domains that we measure in CARES, which I'll describe more later in this presentation. The CARES measure is grounded in the theoretical literature of culturally responsive and asset-based pedagogies, beginning with the work of Gloria Letts and Billings in defining what she called culturally responsive practices. In the 1990s, Dr. Billings highlighted practices that validate student identities while supporting students developing cultural competence and critical consciousness. Then in the 2000s, Geneva Gay outlined an approach that she called culturally responsive teaching, and that focused more on leveraging students' strengths and cultural experiences to make learning more relevant and effective. But as Julie mentioned, culturally responsive practices nomenclature has evolved over several decades, and some in the field began to question whether culturally relevant and culturally responsive went far enough. And in the 2010s, Django Paris extended these models to highlight the need for a shift in the role of schools, where they're not just only validating, but also helping to sustain cultural ways of being in communities of color. And so Dr. Paris's model also underscored the need for schools to teach children directly to critically examine power structures in societies. So in thinking about and developing the name for our measure, we were also conscientious of the harms of color evasive and race neutral language. Research suggests that the ways in which not naming race can lead to color evasive approaches in educational practice. So we wanted to be sure that we, and our approach that we were taking was reflective of the way that we saw racial justice as a central driving force in students' experiences in schools. And so we carefully selected the language of culturally sustaining, anti-racist, and equity supportive practices, which aligns with the 5 domains that we theorize in CARES and attends to the vital need to address racism in this work. So here is a model of the 5 domains of CARES. And so I'm going to take just a minute to kind of go through this because it is quite a complex model. But the C in CARES refers to the connection to curriculum aspect of the work. And so this means the content-specific strategies, such as incorporating cultural reference points, or designing lessons around real-world problems as a means of connecting to students' interests and identities. We also wanted that classroom instruction should provide developmentally appropriate information on racialized history and community context, so that students could reflect on their own racial positionality in the United States. The A in this model reflects authentic relationships, which we felt were characterized by relationships between educators and students, having warmth, caring, and trust, where student voice is elevated and teachers regard youth as experts on their own personhood and affirm their racial, ethnic, and cultural identities. The R is for reflective thinking, which relates to teachers' own examination of their identity and how their identity interacts with that of their students. So reflective thinking really requires critical consciousness, historical awareness, understanding how exposure to racism can affect student behaviors, and examining one's own biases and discomforts, employing mindfulness and non-judgment to understand differences. So a lot of the aspects of the model that Julie was just talking about are really reflected here in the reflective thinking domain that we're measuring. The E, effective communication, refers to recognizing and understanding the distinct interactive styles of students, communication styles, languages, dialects, and knowing how to respond to these styles with appreciation and respect, while also not actually adopting or appropriating any of those communication styles. The effective communication element also involves building students and teachers' own racial literacy and vocabulary fluency. So again, about this nomenclature evolving, really helping the students and teachers to be able to speak and talk effectively about race and racism. And then the S stands for sensitivity to students' identities. And this requires both embracing cultural pluralism and also actively rejecting and challenging deficit views of difference that are based on home or community differences within schools, instead focusing attention on the shortcomings in structures and systems that support positive youth development. So in addition to that, the S really highlights the need to address enactments of bias that may occur in classroom interactions. And so openly having teachers acknowledge their own missteps is something that we're looking for in the CARES, in the S of CARES. So to get at this complex construct, we're assessing CARES in the classroom using a 360 measurement approach. Although we recognize that there are other valuable points of view, including coaches, peers, administrators, and parents, we really honed in for the purpose of this measure on student, teacher, and observer report. And so we're developing 3 tools: a teacher survey, a student survey, and an observational tool. And we're still early in this project. So we're just funded last July, but the project builds on an earlier IES grant that supported a systematic literature review and data collection from over 100 students, as well as a dozen teachers. So based on the findings from these studies and including expert input as part of our development process, our team consisted of 3 work groups that focused on student, teacher, and observer report, and worked on those in these groups to develop updated measures that were inclusive of anti-racist and racial equity focused practices. So we're launching those cognitive interviews this month, as well as focus groups to gain input on the measures and refine them. The purpose of the cognitive interviews is to go item by item in the survey tools and ask students and teachers a series of questions about them to ensure their validity and address validity threats. The focus groups are designed to shed light on solutions to challenges that are related to the feasibility and acceptability of the CARES measure. And so for this presentation, I will be highlighting a few of these threats and challenges and describe how the cognitive interviews and focus groups are designed to help us address them, including resolving issues related to the unit of analysis, epistemological considerations, and some validity threats. So this is being recorded in May, but hopefully, in March, but hopefully by May, I can provide an update on some of the information that we're gaining from the interviews and focus groups that we're currently launching. So first, let's talk about this unit of analysis challenge. This slide shows a Venn diagram that is intended to illustrate some of the overlap and distinctions in what we can measure by asking our 3 informants. So initially expected there would be multiple units of observation, meaning multiple data sources, multiple informants, but the same unit of analysis, meaning that the same construct would be measured. However, as we show here, there are aspects of CARES that one might expect that students will know well, but that teachers or observers might not be well situated to report on, such as how teachers' use of practices is received by students as authentic or validating. Similarly, we're finding that teachers might be better positioned to reflect on their own critical and reflective thinking practices better than observers or students would be, given that these practices are often personal and happen outside of the classroom. And then last, with observer report, we're finding there may be aspects of the classroom that a professional really does need to assess rather than a student, but that teachers themselves might not be able to see as clearly as a classroom observer. So although there's value and necessity in measuring CARES across informants, it does create some complexity. And to resolve this, we're expecting that the contribution of the teacher report may be more to make inferences about the teacher's efforts and intentions to implement CARES practices, so more focused on intent. Whereas the observer's contribution may allow us to more objectively assess the implementation of these practices in the classroom. And then in contrast, the contribution of students' report may be to allow us to make inferences about the impact of the practices as they're experienced by students. So this is particularly important with CARES practices because oftentimes CARES practices are implemented superficially or in ways that can tokenize students without teachers really being aware that that's what's happening. So specifically really recognizing that intent is not the same thing as impact when it comes to CARES practices. And that's uniquely important to discern and assess when we're measuring this construct. So we've been really thoughtful about that in mapping out how we're using these informants to measure the construct of CARES. So just to briefly revisit this overview of CARES, we're also considering whether domains of CARES may be best assessed by various informants, possibly in lieu of all informants assessing all aspects of CARES, just to maximize efficiency and not overburden respondents. So here are some of the questions that we'll be asking to resolve some of these outstanding questions. So in the cognitive interviews with observers, teachers and students were asking a series of questions, sampling from a diversity of teachers and students across a number of identity and demographic characteristics to gain feedback about the inputs, about the items that we've developed. We're talking with students in Missouri and teachers in Minnesota in particular. And then we're also doing some work more locally where we are here in Virginia and in Maryland. And so trying to gather from different places and answer these questions to help us resolve whether or not, for example, we want to focus informants on specific domains of CARES. So one of the other key challenges that we face in the refinement of the CARES measure has to do with epistemology. So we're coming from the point of view as school-based interventionists and the team that I work with, that in order to improve teachers' use of CARES, we really need to measure it in part to assess the effectiveness of intervention and in part to provide formative feedback to teachers so that they can use the information to inform their own professional development. So we really recognize, however, that this view is associated with a post-positivist view, which though it acknowledges that biases and fallibility are inherent in empirical observation, still accepts that the overall empirical stance and use of scientific methods is a valid approach. But on the other hand, much of the literature and theoretical background on culturally responsive and sustaining pedagogy is really emphasizing interpretivism and critical theory, which assumes instead that social reality is constructed in a very specific local context, limiting generalizability, and that knowledge is not objective, but it's shaped by social forces. So in developing this measure and items to assess this, we've felt a lot of this tension between these different epistemologies and their assumptions. So for example, one that comes up a lot is the question of culturally responsive for whom? As culturally responsive practices are highly sensitive to local context and the positionality of teachers and students in the classroom. So on that point, we are coming to this task of measuring CARES practices, recognizing the complexity of what we're trying to do with sensitivity to issues related to positionality and intersectionality. So, for example, we recognize that the same behavior by, say, a white teacher in the classroom may be experienced by an African-American student quite differently if their peers are primarily white, as opposed to if their peers are primarily Black. And so if they have a lot of same race representation in the classroom versus if they're an American minority, they're going to interpret and experience behaviors differently. So really acknowledging that that context shapes the way that practices are experienced. And then vice versa, the same behavior may be experienced quite differently by students if their teacher is Black relative to if their teacher is white. And so with the observational measure, really aim to take into account some of these differences in the local context of the racial composition of the classroom. And so we are attempting to get at some of these issues by triangulating racial positionality across the three measures. And we'll be running moderated nonlinear factor analyses to try to understand how these different configurations and positionalities affect the way that we can measure CARES. And so here we show, and on the right here, a method for assessing the classroom externally assigned race based on phenotypic traits in the observational measure. And so this is a really tricky issue for us and thinking through how to do this. We're certainly drawing on other data sources, but we carefully train the observers that we're not measuring actual race or ethnicity as a self-identity, but more assessing this as a proxy for the potential exposure to systemic, institutional, and interpersonal racism. But knowing that this is quite complex, we in the cognitive interviews are planning to assess how observers are understanding this training and these questions. And so in the cognitive interviews, we'll be asking them a set of questions shown here to try to assess that approach. And then last, I'll review some validity threats that we're working through to resolve in the cognitive interviews and focus groups. So the first validity threat is that many of the practices central to CARES are often cross-examined with the question, isn't this just good teaching? So for example, sharing power is a theme within CARES that can look like giving students meaningful responsibilities in the classroom, which some might claim is really just good teaching. To counter this and address the threat that CARES could become a race or culture neutral measure, we wanted to find a way to ensure that the measure was not just neutrally assessing the use of practices with all students or the average student, but rather with students who cope with being targeted by racism and discrimination, or in the context of multilingual and linguistically diverse classrooms. So we developed some prompts in the teacher report to focus their attention on these groups as a way of addressing the issue of isn't this just good teaching, but we're exploring other approaches as well. A second validity threat is social desirability bias, which particularly affects teacher report. We also have found that external observers are concerned about this and not wanting to negatively evaluate teachers. So to address issues like these, one of the approaches that we've developed is to move from Likert-based agreement or even Likert-based frequencies that are more general to asking about very specific frequencies and consistencies of certain practices, with the idea that this can prompt a focus and put teachers and observers in a position to really have to consider, well, how often am I really engaging in that practice and with what degree of consistency? And so getting at this level of granularity and specificity we're hoping will help with some of this issue. And so we're also going to be ascertaining teacher and observer responses to this approach in the cognitive interviews. A third example of a validity threat we're working to resolve has to do with consequential validity. So we expect this measure to be used for research, but we're carefully attending to its potential use for formative purposes or summative purposes in the grant as well. So in the teacher focus groups, we're inquiring about the acceptability of this approach overall. Will teachers be open to receiving this formative feedback from observers and what concerns might they have? Similarly, we're going to ask them about how they feel about receiving formative feedback from students in the CARES domain and are interested in hearing their responses to that. And then finally, we're also exploring input from parents about the feasibility and acceptability of the 360 approach and whether or not they feel it's valuable to assess CARES practices and specific content areas that they think that we should include or exclude. And so we're currently launching this data collection, and I'm looking forward to sharing more with you about that in May. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate this and looking forward to our discussion.
Welcome. Thank you all for joining us. I'm Catherine Bradshaw. I'm the moderator for this session. I think you've just spent a little bit of time with Julie and Jessica if you had a chance to watch their pre-recorded materials. So we're just going to wait a few minutes while people get in and get settled. And then I have a few opening questions, but I would encourage you all to use the question and answer feature to type in some questions if you have them. So maybe you can go ahead and start typing away because we really like to hear from the audience some questions that you all might have for Julie and Jessica that were inspired by some of their opening remarks. I'll kick us off here in just a minute with a few things that I had on the top of my mind, but we really want to make sure that we hear from you all because this is intended to stimulate ideas and conversation among you all today. So feel free to type in some question and answer sessions. Certainly answers if you have them, but questions maybe to kick off the dialogue. So again, I'm Catherine Bradshaw, and thank you so much for joining us. I've gotten to know a little bit about these projects. I work with Jessica on the CARES project and happen to be a consultant on Julie's project as well. So I have a little bit of background knowledge on these two projects, but really excited to hear from our two experts on this panel here about some of the background work. So Jessica, can you kick us off a little bit and tell us about some of the spring data collection that you've been doing on the project? I know when you had done the recording, you were thinking, oh, wow, if I just had a few more weeks, I could share a few more of the findings from this project. But we caught you just before you had some of the qualitative data collection. Can you share with us some updates from the field since the project has still been ongoing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, great to have a chance to provide some updates because this was a few months ago and we've been doing a bunch of data collection. And so with the development of this 360 measure, we really do feel it's so important that we're laying this groundwork with the cognitive interviews and focus groups that we've been doing. And so we have completed cognitive interviews with the observers for the observational measure. We've done 6 interviews with teachers for the individual cognitive interviews and 8 interviews with 5th through 11th graders for the student cognitive interviews. and have been in recruitment and have 10 parents and 10 teachers going for the focus groups that we're doing. So we're making a lot of progress on that front, as well as holding meetings with district partners to prepare for the launch of our pilot data collection, and have been building up a new platform for training our observers. So the new platform is actually on Google Classroom after doing some research to figure out what was going to be most workable in the different sites that we'll be working in. That's what we decided on. And so we're getting ready to get everything up to speed so we can start our first wave of data collection. But this groundwork has been really important with some major takeaways that have implications for changes that we're making to the measures, as well as just bigger picture kind of interesting findings around the ways that teachers are sort of referring to their own intersectional identities as an influential factor in how they're interpreting some of the items that we're showing them, as well as more broadly in what types of culturally sustaining practices they can or should implement. So for example, there's been some references to how students are seeing the teachers if they're white or if they're male, how students are seeing the teachers if they're Black, how Black female colleagues shared that some of the things that they are able to do may be different from what white teachers may be able to do. And so there's just a lot of sensitivity that we're getting from the teachers on their identity as an influential factor. And then for the students, some of the major takeaways that we've had, and one of the challenges that we've had is that students' sort of conceptual understanding and development of the language that we use. Many upper elementary students are just beginning to acquire vocabulary related to equity or justice or culture. And so with some of that early conceptualization of that language kind of in development, it's affecting the way that we're thinking about how we're writing the items. And so the cognitive interviews are helping us with some adjustments to those items as well. So that's kind of where we are at right now as an update on some of what we're presenting in the pre-recorded session.
Great. Just to pick up on the language piece, I do find that the kind of moving target of the language is a challenge. I don't know if you want to say any more about that, or if Julie, you've encountered that too. I know some of the work that Jessica and I've been doing together, we found this even when we go back and look at some lessons that we wrote 2 or 3 or even 4 or 5 years ago, we're like, ooh, you know, we got to update this, we got to change that, or some of the tip sheets or fact sheets that, you know, how to keep that fresh, how to kind of keep up with that. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that, Jessica, or you want to pick up on that theme about the language and even running language by the district and kind of making sure everyone's still engaged with the language piece.
Absolutely. I think when we started this work, we were really, you know, with the double check project, we were really talking about culturally responsive practices. Even in doing this project, evolving more to talking about culturally sustaining. And so thinking about responsiveness is different from being culturally sustaining in that we're not just responding to students, but we're really trying to help support and socialize students and provide that continued socialization. Just today, I was talking with our colleague, Laura Henderson, and she was sharing with me the language of culturally revitalizing and culturally revitalizing pedagogy being really important in Indigenous communities where some of that culture is actually lost and needs to be reestablished, and the role of schools in thinking about that. So I think there are really substantive, meaningful differences as we're thinking through this evolution of the language that we're using. It really maps onto the evolution of our own growth as we're building in this field. But I do also think that there are some challenges with kind of evading certain things that happens with the evolution of language too, and that causes challenges and also that certain words get played so much that they stop meaning as what they originally meant. And so I do think those are challenges. I'm curious, Julie, what your thoughts are on some of those things.
Yeah, I think the language is challenging. I mean, one, in that it is ever evolving. And so sort of which terms are you using? I think the other thing that we're trying to navigate too is sort of the audience, the teacher community that we're in. It is largely white, and you know, they're serving students of color, but sort of finding the sweet spot as to where are they in their journeys and sort of what language is used for folks who are new to this journey, and what language sits better with folks who are further along in this journey. And so I think that that's been some interesting conversations that we've been having or noticing with our coaches in terms of different spaces that they're in. So yeah, language really matters, and it's interesting to watch it evolve.
We have a couple of questions in the chat, so I will read off one, and this was one that I had thought about as well. It's from an anonymous participant, and it says, to what degree have state or local politics hampered your ability to recruit and retain participants in your projects? In your own experience, just having certain words in the project description, like identity or culture, can create barriers to even discussing the project. So any thoughts about the political issue more generally, or more specific to this issue of recruitment and language? So any thoughts for our colleague who's written in here?
Absolutely. Context is everything right now. And I would say, I mean, both the political context, but also the sort of post-COVID context. I mean, we've had, I've been doing work in schools for the last 20 years. We've had more administrative turnover in the districts that I've in than I've ever seen, and just how challenging that can be, because obviously this work with equity or culturally sustaining practices, just, it takes time. And I appreciate that IES has been working with us and, in sort of helping us think through working with fewer schools longer, actually, to be able to look at this. So there's that context, but then also we certainly have had challenges with regard to recruitment. We do use the word equity and culturally responsive practices on our flyers. And some of them, I'm sure, are just not even responding. Others we've had sort of start the process and get into conversations with us and get excited about the work. And others, I had one who did not end up staying with us saying, I can see how many ways this could go sideways with our parents. And so I just think when we think about the variety of different schools in the surrounding Columbus area, some of which are really sort of embattled in challenges with sort of parents taking them to task on different things, and they're responding differently. And I think our response to our project sort of aligns with that. The schools that are not interested in this work or concerned about this work, or we're not getting bites from them in terms of recruitment.
Jessica, you want to talk about this?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what we've been doing is working with districts that have shown some readiness and commitment to some track record of doing work related to equity, largely because that signals readiness to actually get into some productive work. And so, I've benefited actually hugely from working with one really large district that has a fully staffed Office of Equity, staffed by people of color, with an executive director, a senior manager, multiple equity specialists. They have an overarching equity policy. And so that work that they're doing is really, really robust, and they're very ahead of the curve, but they're in a very diverse area with a lot of pushback. They've been getting a lot of pushback. And so it's been almost a really good mentorship for me to see how they've really managed to build some sustained momentum in the work they're doing by having an equity policy that they're really sticking to. At the same time that they push back on me on some of the language, because we've come in really robust, like we have this language, we want to use it, we want to talk about this, we want to not shy away from these conversations. And they've actually really encouraged us to kind of think about some of the language, like privilege. In particular, the language of privilege is one that they push back on us in ways that it may alienate some teachers. And so really helping us to think through how to attend to how all teachers will receive some of what we're trying to do in a way that can engage them. Of course, knowing, and we've had these conversations, knowing that some teachers never really are going to engage, and some teachers are already like pioneering doing this work. And so really trying to find that middle zone of teachers that we can work with. And similarly, so that's a really pioneering district that I'm mentioning now, but we're also working with a district that's just kind of coming up and really showing signs of readiness, but isn't nearly that far along. And so it's really been beneficial working with them, because there is a lot of opportunity for us to provide some guidance. So yeah, we have also worked with other districts where it's a lot harder, and I don't think those have been very productive partnerships, I guess I would say.
Great. We have another question in the chat here from Kent McIntosh. To what extent and how do you involve individuals who are least likely to benefit from education, BIPOC individuals in your project teams? To what extent and how do you involve individuals who are least likely to benefit from education? So for example, BIPOC individuals in your project teams.
I can say certainly with this project, I have really benefited from an amazing advisory board to start. And so our advisory board represents folks from 4 different states and Canada, and a variety of different lived experiences and a variety of different students, BIPOC students and students of different lived experiences. And I don't think I've ever had a more active and engaged advisory board. So that is really, we rely heavily on them in terms of vetting a lot of our material and getting their perspectives on that. Once we get into the schools, it's a little bit tougher. We're engaging with teachers in 2 different ways. One is through an interactive technology platform, which is available to all staff. And then the other is through a social network analysis that identifies the coaches who we are sort of training to be the implementation supports to teachers. And we do have some members of color on those coach teams, but we really don't have many members of color in the school to be on it. And so I do also worry about overburdening the few Black women who are in the building, although they're very engaged in the work and excited. So it's an interesting sort of dynamic in some of the schools we're in when they're largely teachers who are white.
Yeah, I would say the same. We definitely have consultants who are people of color who are providing feedback on the measures that we're developing. But importantly, too, the leadership of the project, the faculty on the project that are leading the project, particularly those developing the student report measure, are Black women scholars who I have been hugely grateful, but I've been so lucky to be able to work with over like a decade now with Katrina Debnam and Laura Henderson, also someone who's been providing a lot of leadership on the development of the student report measure, and who I've also worked with for a number of years. And so I think that's just been like, in addition to having advisory, like having folks who are really leading elements of the work has been helpful for me to kind of see things from a different perspective. I mean, obviously, we're white women here leading this this talk, and so I really appreciate this question from you, Kent, kind of highlighting the importance and need for folks of color to be at the table with this work. Absolutely.
I wanted to shift gears a little bit to another question about data and providing feedback to teachers. Sometimes data can be perceived as punishing or critical, and especially when you're providing feedback around data related to culturally responsive practices or equitable practices in the classroom. How have you thought about the way in which that can be received to teachers and the way that that can be couched in a way that is supportive and empowering, rather than being perceived in a way that shuts down the conversation or puts them down? So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you've approached that as an opportunity for growth and to inspire change, rather than creating a situation of shame or shutting teachers down.
Want me to start, Julie?
You want me to start, or you want to? But either way, go for it.
So yeah, this is something that we've been thinking about really seriously with our measure, like how this feedback that we collect from the teachers, the students, and the observers would be delivered to the teachers in ways that are supportive and growth focused. And so we do have like an element of the project further on that is really about that, where we're doing some qualitative work about the actual delivery of the scores and the feedback from the measures. But at this point, with our qualitative data collection, one of the main takeaways that we have had, which I think we knew, but hearing it from the teachers, was the extent to which this measure evoked emotional responses. Some of the teachers in the cognitive interviews felt encouraged because they felt that the things that they were doing were affirmed by the measures. But other teachers used words like heaviness, tiredness, and even shame to describe how they felt. And so, there wasn't a question per se in our cognitive interviews asking about emotional response, but this really seemed like it was coming up as a theme and suggests to me the power of this tool to kind of be motivational or to really demotivate. So that's something that we're attending to as we tweak some of the language in the items. But I also think a really major consideration is sort of the use argument for the measure. And so we've been really clear from the beginning that we aren't intending for this measure to be used in an evaluative way, that this is really designed to be formative. And so in the conversations that I've been having with our district partners, I'm trying to think through and brainstorm ways that eventually this measure could be used in the context of like a professional learning community or other sort of cultural context, like context in the school that really are emphasizing professional growth and highlighting that like these spaces need to be where we're prioritizing a sense of cultural humility, where we're really recognizing that not one of us knows or sees every other person's experience. And so that we're delivering this feedback and giving this in the sense of fostering spaces where vulnerability is valued as like a necessary precursor to change. Like all of that really needs to be the context in which this is used. And I think that's hugely dictated by administrators setting the tone or grade level team leads setting the tone for the use of the tool. And so that's something that we're really thinking about very seriously before we actually try to disseminate this measure, is how we can set the stage for that to be a growth oriented and supportive environment for its use.
Yeah, I think that comes up in a variety of different ways in our project. So, I mean, like I said, with our technology platform, I mean, one of the ways we've really tried to focus on engagement is by thinking about autonomy and choice. That, many times in schools or in any sort of initiative, when equity work is sort of forced or required, that there can be backlash. And so we've really been sort of thinking about what does the teacher have in terms of choice and autonomy to choose the activities on the platform, sort of titrating or scaffolding the information in a variety of different ways so that they can sort of choose what fits them, but also hoping to push them, beyond their comfort zone. We've also had a lot of conversations this year with the coaches about just how much trust is needed between a coach and a teacher if they're talking about implementation supports, to sort of talk about data and think about it from an equity lens. And we have certainly learned a lot about the challenges of trust in our coach teams, right? So we have some who have been there many years, some newer folks, they may be playing other roles in the district, like being a union leader, right? And so how those other roles might get in the way of some of these conversations. And so we've been sort of talking about how do we engage in more trust building as we move into the next year. And again, giving teachers choice as to which coach they go to for supports because of those other relationships or roles that they hold in the district. And then, when we are thinking about sort of the emotion that data can evoke, we are we do a 2-day summer institute with our coaches. And just this week, we were talking about using some of this feedback to sort of have activities around just presenting a number with nothing else. And like, what does, if it's a low number, if it's a high number, how does that evoke responses, emotional responses? And how do we lean into those emotions and lean into the communication about what this can be toward, with a focus on growth. But data is threatening, and coaches, we've had a lot of conversations about who gets to see those data, when do principals get to see data, if it's between a coach and a teacher. And so we've been navigating a lot, again, like the role of the assistant principal on these coach teams. And we've actually sort of moved to calling them more of a liaison between the coach team and the admin, because they're in a very evaluative role. And so it's been tough for teachers to view them as able to put on a different hat and be supportive. So it's been really interesting to see sort of all the different roles that people are playing with regard to sort of talking about data and what it means.
And I think that brings up another interesting point. And Jessica, your project with the CARES 360 model, you have different sources of data from different perspectives, and this issue about students reporting, and that can be controversial because usually we have teachers rating students, and the idea of students rating teachers, or even parents rating teachers. Maybe you can talk a little bit about, as you all lean into that, what data you plan to select from different sources, how you plan to pull all that together, and how to ease into that, and where you see that ultimately landing, of what kind of data you might get from different sources.
Absolutely. It's something that we're really attuned to in talking to our district partners, because I mean, I think they even highlighted that there may be some union issues if there was any perception that like students are evaluating teacher performance. And so another reason why this is really not intended to be evaluative and not presented and going to be in any kind of framework of evaluation. But definitely, I think one of the reasons that we think that the 360 approach is important for this issue of CARES, of culturally sustaining and anti-racist and equity supportive practices, is this whole issue of like intent is not the same thing as impact. And teachers really may have these intentions and be making these efforts. And we think it's important to measure that. So we certainly have the teacher component, teacher self-report component to this, which I think also can have an intervention sort of aspect to it. It can be an intervention in itself for teachers to do that sort of self-reflection. But we also really are valuing the observers' perspectives, which are going to get more hope, maybe not objectively, but get more at what's really happening in the classroom from an external perspective. Because Catherine, you and I have talked about so many times social desirability bias issues with teacher self-report. And so I think we've really valued having observers go into the classroom and do that. And then from the student perspective, we're emphasizing that actually may be how all this lands. So getting back to that issue of intent's not the same thing as impact. The teachers may intend this, the observers might be seeing this happen, but what's really like, what is the real felt lived experience of that from the students' perspectives? And so, this sort of arrangement of three different perspectives, I think is important. We've also had a colleague on the team talk about parent perspective being an important one to consider integrating. So this is a really complex, sensitive thing to measure. And I think there are a lot of different perspectives that do need to be triangulated. And that's the key work of the project that we're just starting, is to try to figure out some of these elements around which informant's going to be the best, or maybe not the best, but the right fit for the right interpretation that we're looking for.
Yeah, my hat is off to you for the student ratings of the teacher. That'll be interesting IRB wise and research wise. But I do think, this brings up just an interesting thing that maybe many of us in the room are navigating around. We're doing this work sort of clinically, right? But we're also doing this work from a research perspective. And so when are the data confidential to the teacher as a participant, and when are they shared in, among people in the building? And we've certainly had many of conversations with our education partners around that. And sometimes they're dissatisfying to them when I sort of say, well, no, they're research participants, these are their data, we're not sharing them, versus, they have given us consent to share this aspects of it. So I think in this space, the confidentiality piece and use of data is really interesting.
Any kind of closing comments on the technology piece? Both of you are using technology in different ways in your work, and even if you could flash forward where you see you might land at the end of these projects on the use of technology and the models that you're developing.
Well, I will say for us, I think, we've seen a lot of benefit in a variety of different realms of having interactive sort of guided technology user flows for teachers, because they can be efficient and they can guide teachers to to places efficiently when there's not personnel resources to do that. I think with the equity work, it is also nice that we're seeing people do kind of appreciate a private space. And we're really excited about sort of capturing some of these qualitative responses literally in the moment after they've watched 2 scenarios or watched a vignette, and sort of what are they thinking. So I think we're excited about sort of what data are going to emerge from this to learn about sort of teachers' process in these self-reflections. But as with everything, we see engagement with the technology wane over the course of the year. And I think we really need the interpersonal catalyst to keep people engaged in it and keep people going back to it, or keep people to do the self-reflections and then come to an interpersonal environment to really do the next step of the work. So.
Mhm. Yeah, I think I really agree with that. And some of the imaginings of where it could go with the CARES measure, and I've sort of shared some of these ideas with you, Catherine, but I think it could be possible that teachers could have an app where they are able to, we can send them a video camera, they can video themselves teaching, the students they could administer a survey to students, and they could do their self-report and send out the data. And that data there could be an automated way that data could be presented in a report form to them that then could translate to like connecting into sort of the type of model that you've done, Julie, where they can really use that information to make database decisions about where they want to prioritize their professional development, professional growth. And even thinking about some of the AI pieces, that's really looking probably quite far ahead. And I think we have to be careful with using AI with equity in particular. But it may be that there is some place where some AI-based coaching could be a supplement. I do think it comes back to, you do have to have this interpersonal piece that you're talking about, Julie. I think I wouldn't stray far from that, but I think there are elements that could be helpful to teachers, again, in this sort of private space, where I think with CARES work that there is some appreciation of that privacy and anonymity that can happen, where there could be some utility for AI-based coaching model. So.
Well, thank you both for sharing your lessons learned and your works in progress with us. I know it's tough when you've got new projects and things that are still unfolding in real time to pause and reflect and share with the rest of the group. And really appreciate your taking that time to share with so many of us here today. Thank you all. Hope everybody's had a great time at the IES conference and look forward to the next couple of days. And thanks so much for those of you that joined us here this afternoon. Look forward to hearing more tomorrow. Enjoy the rest of the conference, everyone. Take care. Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for coming.